NBA YoungBoy just revealed why he hates Birdman, and the details he's revealing are wild. In a new song, YoungBoy claims Birdman never truly loved him, and says he should have listened to Lil Wayne's warning. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Let me break it down. The line landed on a track called Tears of War, and it didn't take long for people to figure out who it was about. YoungBoy rapped, "Knew that Stunna never loved me, should have listened to Carter." Stunna is Birdman's nickname. Carter is Lil Wayne, and the reference to Wayne wasn't random. It went straight back to something Wayne had said publicly years earlier about YoungBoy trusting the wrong man. Back in 2020, on a Lil Uzi Vert collaboration called Multiple Flows, Wayne dropped a line that barely got noticed at the time. "I'm street smart, Lil Wody. That's edumacation, and I had told YoungBoy to watch out for old head." Nobody thought much of it in 2020. Birdman and YoungBoy were close. They'd go on to release a whole joint mixtape together the next year. But Wayne knew something. Wayne had lived the exact story YoungBoy was about to walk into, and he tried to warn him before it happened. Here's the thing about that warning. Wayne wasn't guessing. He spent his childhood literally from age 9 inside Birdman's orbit. Lil Wayne was just 9 years old when he met his surrogate father and label boss Brian "Birdman" Williams. That relationship built one of the biggest empires in rap history. It also eventually blew up into one of the ugliest label disputes hip-hop has ever seen. With Wayne suing for tens of millions of dollars over money, he said he was never paid. So when Wayne told YoungBoy to watch his back around old head, he wasn't throwing shade for fun. He was handing down a lesson written in his own blood, sweat, and unpaid royalties. YoungBoy didn't listen, or at least not right away. By 2021, he and Birdman were deep into a partnership that looked from the outside like a genuine bond between two Louisiana natives. From the Bayou is a collaborative mixtape by YoungBoy Never Broke Again and Birdman, and the title refers to both artists' home state of Louisiana, with YoungBoy from Baton Rouge and Birdman from New Orleans. The project had actually been in the works since 2018, so this wasn't some quick cash grab collaboration. It was years in the making, a real creative relationship between the two. And Birdman didn't just show up to collect a feature check. He talked about YoungBoy like he was the future of the entire genre. In a FaceTime call that later got posted online, Birdman told him directly that hip-hop needed him. "We need you, bruh," Birdman told YB. "This shit watered down, man. We gotta save hip-hop, bruh. Nephew, gotta save this shit, bruh." That's not a business partner talking. That's the language of a mentor, an older figure trying to pull a young artist into a bigger purpose. He called him nephew. He said hip-hop needed saving, and that YoungBoy was the one who could do it. Around the same time, Birdman was telling reporters the same thing in public. Speaking to Billboard, he said watching how fast YoungBoy worked and how much value his music carried genuinely impressed him. He wasn't hedging. He put his name behind it in interviews, on Instagram, in front of cameras. To anyone watching from outside, this looked like the start of something real. An OG passing the torch to the next generation, on his own terms, in his own state. So what changed? That's the part that made Tears of War hit so hard when it dropped. According to DJ Academics, who premiered the track, Tears of War is the last song that YoungBoy recorded before his recent arrest. Whatever soured between him and Birdman, it happened fast, and it happened right before YoungBoy's life got put on hold again. One minute, Birdman is calling him nephew and preaching about saving hip-hop together. The next, YoungBoy is on a recording saying Birdman never loved him at all. The strange part is that even after the song leaked, Birdman didn't retaliate. If anything, he kept defending YoungBoy in public, hard. When podcast host Joe Budden went off on YoungBoy's music, calling it flat out bad multiple times over, Birdman jumped in front of the situation immediately. He posted a direct warning on his Instagram stories aimed right at Budden. "Joe Budden, you fucking with something you should leave alone," followed by Stunna Corleone Gotti and Barg. "Never broke again'll. See." That's not the post of a man who's washed his hands of a relationship. That's someone still standing guard over YoungBoy's name. Months after a diss track, calling him out by nickname had already circulated. It's part of what makes this story so complicated. The two of them were simultaneously feuding on wax and defending each other in public. And it wasn't the first time Birdman had gone to bat for him either. Months earlier, when Budden mocked one of YoungBoy's public campaigns, YoungBoy fired back with threats of his own. And again, Birdman stepped in with a warning of his own, aimed at the podcast host. So by the time Tears of War surfaced, fans were left holding two completely different stories at once. On one hand, a public mentor still willing to go to war with commentators over YoungBoy's name. On the other, a private grievance, serious enough for YoungBoy to record it, as one of the last things he did before his freedom got taken away again. Something happened between the FaceTime calls and the studio session that turned nephew into a man. YoungBoy said never loved him. And to understand what that something actually was, you have to look past the two of them entirely and into the 60-year pattern Birdman built his empire on before YoungBoy ever crossed paths with Birdman. An entire generation of rappers had already lived this exact story. Cash Money Records wasn't just a label, it was a machine that Birdman and his brother built from the ground up in New Orleans. And almost every artist who came up through it eventually walked away saying the same thing. They never got what they were owed. Start at the beginning. Before the Hot Boys were superstars, Cash Money already had artists moving real numbers independently. Cash Money's albums were selling between 25,000 and 50,000 copies without any major label distribution deal, and the Hot Boys' debut sold an astonishing 300,000 copies in its first few months, almost exclusively in the New Orleans area. That success is what brought every major label to Louisiana in 1998, all trying to sign the Williams brothers. But before any of that mainstream money showed up, there was already a first wave of artists who felt burned. Lil Slim, one of the earliest Cash Money artists, has talked about how the label handled its early stars, and it wasn't just about missed payments. He accused Birdman of straight up taking one of his own artists. As if stolen gig money and non-payment of royalties wasn't enough, Lil Slim has one more complaint. Cash Money stole his artist, a young rapper from his neighborhood who he brought to Birdman, with the understanding he'd help present the kid to the world. That kid from the neighborhood eventually turned into one of Cash Money's biggest names. Slim says he watched the entire relationship get repackaged and rewritten, so his own role in it disappeared. Sound familiar? A young artist gets pulled close by someone who promises to build with them, and once the value becomes clear, the original architect of the relationship gets erased. Then there's the era that made Cash Money famous. The Hot Boys. Juvenile, BG, Turk, and a teenage Lil Wayne turned the label into a phenomenon. With Back That Ass Up and 400 Degrees. And one by one, every single member of that group eventually left over money. BG of the Hot Boys left Cash Money in 2001, and his group mate Turk left in 2002, and Cash Money soundscaper Manny Fresh left in 2005, saying he left because of money. Juvenile echoed the exact same reasoning years later, saying flatly that the reason most artists leave their label is money. Turk didn't just leave quietly either. He eventually sued. Turk sued Cash Money for $1.3 million in 2015, citing shady accounting, before settling out of court for an undisclosed amount. Think about that. A guy who helped build the label from a teenager, who was part of the sound that put Cash Money on the map, had to take his own family label to court just to get an accurate accounting of what he was owed. And then there's Wayne, the same man who warned YoungBoy to watch his back. Wayne's fallout with Birdman is arguably the most public label collapse in modern hip-hop. It wasn't a quiet parting. Lil Wayne accused Birdman and Cash Money of neglecting to register Wayne's name on copyrights, failing to make escrow payments, and not making due on a promised $10 million advance, among other grievances in a $51 million lawsuit. This is the man Birdman raised from age 9, the man who made Cash Money a billion-dollar name. And even he ended up in court, fighting for money he says was never properly accounted for. What makes this pattern so damning isn't just that individual artists complained. It's that the complaints repeat, word for word, across 3 decades. And 3 completely different generations of rappers. Different names, different eras, same story. An artist joins, builds something real, becomes valuable, and then discovers the numbers don't add up. Wendy Day, the industry negotiator who actually helped Birdman land his original $30 million distribution deal with Universal, learned this firsthand herself. When she went to collect her standard finder's fee for helping negotiate that deal, Birdman allegedly told her, "Sue me. When I have to pay you, you'll get paid." That's the same man doing the same thing to the person who helped build his empire's foundation in the first place. So when YoungBoy's people started drawing comparisons between his situation and everyone who came before him, they weren't reaching. They were pointing at a documented, decades-long pattern that predates YoungBoy's entire career. Every era of Cash Money produced its own list of artists who say they got shorted. The first generation, the Hot Boys. Wayne himself, the label's biggest star ever. And now, potentially, the newest name Birdman ever wrapped his arm around in public. That's the backdrop YoungBoy walked into when he and Birdman got close in the early 2020s. He wasn't dealing with a mentor who had a clean track record and one bad moment with him specifically. He was dealing with a man whose entire career, across 60 years and multiple generations of artists, kept ending the same way. And the warning had already been shouted from the rooftops by the one person who lived through the whole thing. Wayne himself, years before YoungBoy ever set foot in a Cash Money session. While all of that history sat quietly in the background, YoungBoy's own business situation was getting complicated in a very specific way, and Birdman was standing right in the middle of it. By 2022, YoungBoy was publicly unhappy with Atlantic Records, the label he'd been signed to since he first blew up. YoungBoy never broke again, signed his 5-year record deal with Atlantic, and his music began being officially licensed to a company titled Never Broke Again, LLC. That deal had made him one of the biggest streaming artists alive, but as the years went on, he made no secret of wanting out. He turned down a resigning offer that would have kept him there, and reports at the time pegged the number he rejected at a striking figure. He reportedly declined a $25 million resigning offer from the label, and stated he wants a $100 million deal to secure his services. Right in the middle of that standoff, whispers started swirling that YoungBoy was about to jump ship entirely, straight into Birdman's camp. The deal has yet to be confirmed by either YoungBoy or Cash Money CEO Birdman, but the speculation surrounding the agreement is believed to have validity, given the rapper's search for a new label home amid his discontent with Atlantic Records. The number attached to that rumored deal was massive, $60 million, tied directly to Cash Money Records, tied directly to Birdman. This is where things get interesting. Birdman wasn't just a collaborator anymore in these rumors. He was being floated as YoungBoy's actual next boss. And Birdman fed the narrative himself, publicly, before any ink hit paper. Talking about YoungBoy right before From the Bayou dropped, he made a prediction that got repeated everywhere. Ain't no Naya gon' be bigger than NBA YoungBoy. Numbers don't lie. He's the biggest YouTube artist and he behind the wall, Birdman said, adding that once YoungBoy gets his mind right and comes from under his current situation, this at only 20 years old, would surpass artists a decade older than him. That's not a casual endorsement, that's Birdman openly positioning himself as the guy who would help YoungBoy realize his full value, the guy who understood what he was worth better than the label he was currently under contract with. It's the exact same pitch that worked on Wayne at age 9, on the Hot Boys as teenagers, on Lil Slim's Artist decades earlier. Come to me. I see what you're really worth. I'll get you there. And here's the detail that made the whole thing land differently in hindsight. YoungBoy never actually confirmed that $60 million Cash Money deal happened. It stayed a rumor. What did happen in plain public record is that From the Bayou itself came out through a tangle of 5 different labels and companies at once. The 9-track project was released through Atlantic Records, Interscope Records, Cash Money Records, Universal Motown Records, and YoungBoy's own label, Never Broke Again. 5 entities, all with a stake in one project. That's not a clean handoff from one label to another. That's a web, and webs are exactly where money tends to disappear inside the music business. Meanwhile, YoungBoy kept telling anyone who'd listen that he still had obligations to work through with Atlantic before he could fully move anywhere else. Speaking to DJ academics around the same period, he was blunt about it. He confirmed he still had one more album to release before he fulfilled his contract with Atlantic Records, saying probably drop one more mixtape, then I'ma drop my album, and it's over with, adding that the label wasn't gonna come back to me, because I ain't trying to hear shit they got to say. So even at the exact moment Birdman was publicly predicting his ascension to the top of the game, YoungBoy himself was still boxed in, tied to a 5-year deal he didn't fully control, being courted by a man whose entire career was built on artists ending up exactly that boxed in. It's worth sitting with how familiar that setup is. Wayne was locked into Cash Money as a literal child. The hot boys signed as teenagers who by their own accounts didn't even understand what publishing meant. Now here's YoungBoy in his early 20s, tangled in a 5-way distribution deal, being told by the same man who built that pattern that he was destined to be the biggest artist alive. If only he'd trust the process. The $60 million Cash Money deal never got officially confirmed. No press release, no contract leak, nothing beyond speculation. But the closeness between the two men only deepened in the years after that rumor first surfaced. They toured together. Birdman showed up on stage with him. He kept talking him up in interviews. By the time you get to more recent years, Birdman was even physically present, supporting YoungBoy's live shows directly. Birdman has been recently supporting NBA YoungBoy on his Massa tour, further developing his most recent massive mentee. That's years after the rumored deal, years after the FaceTime call about saving hip-hop. And it's the same dynamic every single time. Birdman positioned as the elder statesman, YoungBoy positioned as the heir apparent. So when Tears of War dropped and that line about Stuna never loving him surfaced, it wasn't coming out of nowhere, it was coming after years of a relationship that ran through 5 different companies, a rumored 9-figure label jump that never got confirmed, public predictions of greatness, and a 5-year Atlantic contract. YoungBoy was still fighting his way out of the entire time. Whatever business actually happened behind closed doors, the pattern on the surface tracked perfectly, with everything that came before it in Birdman's career: closeness, praise, entanglement, and then eventually resentment. YoungBoy's grievance with Birdman didn't play out in a vacuum. It happened while an entire circle of people, collaborators, rivals, commentators, even family, were watching and reacting in real time, and their reactions ended up shaping how the whole story got understood publicly. Start with Wayne because his voice carries the most weight in this entire situation. He wasn't a bystander commenting on someone else's drama. He was the cautionary tale in the flesh, and he'd already put his warning on record years before YoungBoy needed it. When YoungBoy referenced him directly on Tears of War, fans immediately connected it back to that 2020 line on Multiple Flows, where Wayne told the world he'd personally warned YoungBoy about Birdman. 2 artists from 2 different generations of the same label system, one warning the other, almost like an older brother pulling a kid aside before he makes the same mistake twice. Then there's Joe Budden, whose role in this story is almost the opposite of Wayne's. He wasn't warning YoungBoy about Birdman. He was attacking YoungBoy's music entirely, and Birdman jumped to defend him anyway, despite whatever tension existed between them privately. Budden didn't hold back at all. He called YoungBoy's output flatly bad, repeating it over and over on his podcast. He's horrible. He is horrible. He is really, 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 really bad. He went further, suggesting YoungBoy's label had engineered his viral fan moments rather than them happening organically. YoungBoy's response was immediate and furious, telling Budden directly not to speak on him, and inviting him to come say it to his face. But what's notable is who showed up to fight that battle alongside him: Birdman, publicly on Instagram, warning Budden he was messing with something he should leave alone. This happened not once but twice, months apart, across 2 separate Budden controversies. Each time Birdman stepped into the fire for YoungBoy without hesitation, long after the private tension between the two of them had reportedly already started brewing. That's part of what makes this such a complicated story to untangle. If Birdman really had turned on YoungBoy behind the scenes, why keep publicly defending him against outside critics? One read is that public loyalty and private business dealings are 2 completely separate currencies for someone like Birdman. He can go to war for you on Instagram, while the money conversation happening off camera tells a completely different story. That's actually consistent with his entire history. He praised Wayne publicly as a son for years, while the lawsuit over unpaid royalties sat in the background the whole time. Public praise and private shortchanging were never mutually exclusive for him. They ran in parallel for decades with different artists in exactly the same shape. Then there's the wider circle of people whose feuds with YoungBoy indirectly shaped how this Birdman situation got read by fans. Lil Durk's long-running conflict with YoungBoy, stretching back to the death of Durk's affiliate King Von, kept YoungBoy's name in constant tension throughout the same years he was getting close to Birdman. Durk and YoungBoy began beefing on and off since the death of Durk's label mate King Von in 2020, who was fatally shot during an altercation with one of YoungBoy's affiliates. That conflict meant YoungBoy was constantly fighting battles on multiple fronts, one with a rival rapper, one with critics like Budden, and quietly, apparently, one with the very mentor, who was supposed to be helping him rise above all of it. Even Birdman's own family got pulled into the orbit of YoungBoy's drama at various points. Terrence Williams, described as Birdman and Slim's half-brother, weighed in publicly on an unrelated incident involving YoungBoy's time in custody, discussing the long-standing rivalry between him and Durk's camp that reportedly boiled over even behind bars. It shows just how tightly wound YoungBoy's world had become with the Williams family. Not just Birdman himself, but people connected to him commenting on YoungBoy's life from multiple angles. And there's one more voice worth mentioning, because it shows just how far this pattern of public praise and private tension extends beyond even Birdman. DJ Academics, who's been the one consistently breaking news around YoungBoy for years, was the same person who premiered Tears of War in the first place. He described it as the last song YoungBoy recorded before everything fell apart, sharing that YoungBoy had personally told him it was a message for his fans. Academics has continued to be the connective tissue in nearly every major update about YoungBoy's situation since, including more recently, reports about YoungBoy wanting to sit down with Drake for an interview, a rumor that generated its own wave of commentary. Elliot Wilson, on the Bigger Picture podcast, questioned whether that kind of interview would even work, joking about YoungBoy's soft-spoken demeanor and doubting he'd bring any real journalistic edge to a conversation with someone as guarded as Drake. None of that is directly about Birdman, but it paints the picture of a young artist constantly surrounded by bigger names. Wayne warning him, Budden attacking him, Durk feuding with him, Academics reporting on him, Birdman mentoring him, and having to figure out, mostly in public, which of those voices actually had his interests at heart. When you stack all of it side by side, Birdman is the one figure who occupies both sides of that list at once. He was the loudest public defender. He was also, according to YoungBoy's own lyrics, the person who never really loved him at all. By the time Tears of War reached fans, YoungBoy wasn't even free to explain it himself. He was sitting in custody facing a case tied to an alleged prescription fraud scheme in Utah, on top of an existing gun charge that had already cost him his freedom once before. YoungBoy is currently serving a 23-month sentence at FCI Talladega after pleading guilty to a federal gun charge in late 2024, and upon release, he will also be required to complete 60 months of probation. The song about Birdman wasn't a promotional single with interviews and press rollout behind it. It was something recorded in a rush, in what turned out to be his last studio session, before agents showed up at his door. That context matters, because it changes what the song actually is. It's not a calculated business move designed to pressure Birdman publicly or extract a better deal. It's closer to a private thought that got caught on tape right before YoungBoy's life got put on pause again. The kind of thing you say when you don't expect anyone outside your circle to hear it for a while. Academics framed it that way himself when he shared it, saying YoungBoy had told him it was a message for his fans, something to hold them over while he was gone. So what actually gets left behind once you strip away the speculation about deals and rumors and lawsuits? You're left with a very simple, very human through line. A young artist got close to an older figure who had a documented, decades-long history of pulling people in with big talk about greatness and family, and then leaving them fighting for money or credit years later. It happened to Lil Slim's artist. It happened to the Hot Boys, one by one over the course of a decade. It happened to Wayne, the label's single biggest star, who ended up suing his own surrogate father for tens of millions of dollars. And now, according to YoungBoy's own words, some version of that same disappointment found its way to him too. What's different about YoungBoy's case is that he never let it fully play out in public the way Wayne did. There was no multi-year lawsuit saga, no series of open letters, no Free Weezy-style protest album, built entirely around the betrayal. There was one verse on one song released under chaotic circumstances, and then silence, because the artist who wrote it got locked away before he could say anything more. That silence is exactly why the line hit as hard as it did. It read less like a diss track built for headlines and more like something that slipped out because he genuinely meant it with no time left to soften it or explain it further. Birdman, for his part, never publicly responded to the line directly. No Instagram post addressing it, no interview walking it back, nothing resembling the kind of statement he'd fired off, defending YoungBoy against Budden not long before. That silence says something too. When outside critics came for YoungBoy, Birdman was loud, fast, and combative in his defense. When YoungBoy turned that same energy toward him, there was nothing. Maybe because he didn't see the song in time. Maybe because there was nothing left to say once it was out there. Either way, the contrast between how quickly he jumped to defend YoungBoy publicly and how quietly he let this particular accusation sit is its own kind of answer. What happens next for either of them remains genuinely unresolved. YoungBoy is working through the back end of his sentence, with years of probation still ahead of him once he's released. Whatever business relationship existed with Cash Money, whatever the real terms were behind From the Bayou, or the rumored deal that never got confirmed, none of it has been settled publicly the way Wayne's fight with Birdman eventually was. There's no lawsuit on record, no settlement, no follow-up song digging deeper into specifics. Just one line recorded under pressure that connected a young artist's private disappointment to a pattern that's been documented across 3 generations of the same label. Wayne told him to watch out years before it mattered. YoungBoy didn't listen, or maybe he did, and it didn't change anything anyway. Closeness with people like Birdman doesn't always break clean just because you've been warned. He got the mixtape, the tour support, the public praise about being the future of the genre. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, according to his own words, something else was happening that made him feel like none of it ever came from real love in the first place. Whether that's about money that never showed up, or something else entirely that's never been made public, is something only YoungBoy and Birdman actually know. What's on record is the pattern that came before it, the warning that got ignored, and the one verse that finally said what everyone around him had already been saying for years.